like we talked a little bit about the Imaginal last time. I feel like some amount of follow up on the Imaginal would be good. It still feels the most mystical of the things we've talked about.
The Imaginal is the most dangerous. That human beings are juxtaposed between the infinite depths of the Imaginal and the infinite heights of the conscious. The attempt to simply escape the Imaginal and head up towards the light, is an obvious, there's an understandable urge. And that general simple model of the Imaginal below and the conscious above, it makes sense that, again, everything from trying to eradicate or do away with the Imaginal, trying to deny it, trying to disqualify it, trying to kill all the people that seem to be possessed by it so that we can do away with it. Kind of like if it's an infectious disease, and if we just can quarantine all the people infected by it and do away with them, we'll eradicate the disease. That's how we've approached it largely throughout recorded history. And it's how we continue to approach it, really. But we still kind of have this overall ideology that we can eradicate the Imaginal. And I just don't think that's true. And obviously that's not my own novel thought. I'm in that school of thought that I don't think that's true. I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's how it works. And so the turn back towards the Imaginal, not in a let's get possessed and let's move towards unconsciousness, because that's what I think. I think diving deeper into the Imaginal, certainly there's the potential to go more unconscious. But I think a turn back towards it and looking at it consciously is what needs to happen. And again, I think this is this is what depth psychotherapy is about. I think it's what various shamanic and alchemical practices are about. I think it's what various religious practices are about. And, even, for example, the contemporary trend towards, hey, let's look at psychedelics again. Perhaps psychedelics have some legitimacy or some validity, or can be productive somehow. And it's like, well, that's a movement back towards the Imaginal. The psychedelic trip is an Imaginal realm trip. But I'm aware that it's dangerous. I'm not saying people think it's dangerous, but it's not. I'm saying, no, it's dangerous. But there's no real way around it. We're trying to eradicate depression. We're trying to eradicate racism. We're trying to eradicate aggression. And I just think I think it's futile, and I think it's dangerous to try to approach it that way. I think we have to I think the model is wrong. I think we got to look at a model that sees the Imaginal realm as real and as integral to everything from an individual's mental health to the health of our civilization. The modern, there's, we were talking a minute ago about putting language to stuff and trying to be able to talk about this stuff in certain ways. It creating a modern language for this stuff, is important, and people like Carl Jung went a long way towards that, obviously, and that conversation should be continued. And there are, even the neo-Jungians in general started to take it away from what Jung was saying. There's such this tendency to come back to just the cognitive rational. The world of psychotherapy, generally speaking, it started with Freud. Freud was talking about energies. Freud was talking about unconscious motivation. And where psychotherapy is today is it's like 180 degrees. It's about the symptom is the problem, solution-focused brief therapy, which is not psychotherapy. The idea of unconscious motivation is not really looked at anymore. Everything's thought of as a social construction. The idea of energies isn't looked at. It's all about thoughts and beliefs. The idea about transference and projective identification, etc., is not really looked at anymore. Sexuality being a huge component of mental health. Sexuality is now an identity in a way that is off base, I think. A lot of Freud's theories, I think, are misinterpreted and are taken out of context. Trying to talk about those concepts, present a model. I've spent the last 25 years trying to organize my understanding of those things and trying to flesh out what are the insights and where do they apply and where do they not apply. But again, so many of these concepts are understandable. I mean, a lot of it is really deep, complex, abstract stuff that takes contemplation and mulling over and time, and that you gain a deeper and deeper understanding as you go. But that said, there's a lot of concepts here that are not all that difficult to grasp, that simply don't get talked about because there's such an intense attempt by various forces to deliver this narrative that really delegitimizes a lot of the concepts that I just listed.
I just think is an interesting tie-in back to what we were talking about, that there are fair criticisms of Freud, but the criticisms that abandon everything he said is the mistake. That if we miss what he meant for what he said, and obviously that's interpretive. We can't assume we know everything he meant, but anything that doesn't try to transcend and include what someone tried to codify is missing the point. So that if he constructed something, and we've been in this, long period of deconstructing what he said, what's reconstructed in its place? Anything that's reconstructed should consider what is of value there. And assuming there's nothing of value there is a pretty intense ego trip. Anything he said that makes me look at something I don't want to think about must be wrong.
And everything Freud says points to stuff we don't want to look at.
Right.
That was his, he had a knack for that.
I think I have a lot of questions about the Imaginal. Just as far as things you've brought up, I think are worth coming back to. One was just I had not thought about, I think there's a conflation of a psychedelic experience as a consciousness experience. And you're saying it's an imaginal experience. So I think distinguishing that would be interesting. When you talked about Elvis Presley, it made me think about cultural appropriation and because he's dancing like black people in the South danced. Like he's taking things other people did and bringing them to a white audience. And I agree that it's like an expression of the imaginal, but it's interesting when you say that, like, when we see something that comes from that, it like excites something in us. And we don't even have to talk about it, but that's just an interesting thing to me, is like, are we culturally appropriating things that activate the imaginal realm in ourselves? And then the other question was like pharmacology and the imaginal realm, that on a neurological level, the drugs that people are administering to treat these, what you're describing as disconnections from the imaginal realm, how does that work? And I don't know if there's an answer to that, but there are these receptors in the brain that they are modifying with that, and what is the neurological explanation for these drugs that seem to affect our ability to disconnect from the imaginal realm.
Just to clarify, I'm not saying that every experience induced by a psychotropic substance is purely imaginal and not conscious. But I stand by that statement that basically a psychedelic experience is going to be an imaginal experience. It opens in both directions. Let's just say that if you have that model of the imaginal below and the conscious above, it opens it in both directions. And it's important that it opens in both directions, because there are big downsides to only opening upward. Everything from escapism to, even the neurological problems that are symptomatic of being open, too much upward openness and not enough downward. And yeah, the distinction between if you alter brain chemistry, what's really happening? Are you can be cut off from the imaginal, and therefore then your brain, for example, let's say you're not getting enough dopamine, so then you can kind of artificially induce a dopamine response. But that increase in dopamine, while it's gonna have certain effects on how one feels, it doesn't mean their consciousness is opened back up to the imaginal in a way that's healing or growth promoting. So it's
I'll go on record and say it's vitally important, and in no way dismissing its significance. Just thought it was interesting in relation to what you're talking about with the imaginal realm.
Yeah, I mean, whether you talk about a plant medicine that's been used for forever, or whether some drug created in a laboratory, I mean, there's, we're doing all kinds of things to affect our experience. If you go for a run, you're altering your chemistry. I love endurance sports, and I can get on a treadmill, go on a journey in my consciousness that is deep and profound and exciting, and I love it. It's like I've had some of my deepest experiences in life running, and even on a treadmill. Other people say, man, to stand there and run on a treadmill is the most boring, monotonous, lifeless, thing they could possibly imagine. Like, why would anyone ever do that? And I get that if you weren't taking the journey in your mind, the journey in your consciousness, the journey into the imaginal realm, then yeah, it would suck. And I feel like that's a metaphor for life, because you can also have this incredibly exciting, complex adventure happening externally in your life and have it not be moving you because you're not having the imaginal experience along with it. I'm aware when I'm on that treadmill and I'm having this experience as though me maintaining the pace I'm trying to maintain for the amount of time I'm trying to maintain it. On a certain level, I'm aware I'm not saving the world by achieving that. But it's like the epic, heroic journey that I'm having feels like I am. And there's something going on that isn't just fantasy. It's not just an ego trip. I'm not just training so that I can do better in the next race I run or get healthier. There's a process happening in my consciousness that is developmental and healing and fulfilling. So it what I'm saying kind of it brings it back to this idea of like, well, okay, so we all just, does exoteric reality have, really not have anything to do with anything, and it's all just absolute subjectivism, and we're all just living these fantasies in our head, and blah blah blah. And I'm not saying that. I think there's an interplay though, and that our imaginal experience and having these narratives, these archetypes, these processes occurring is so important, and understanding them, having communal experience around them is so important, and obviously is lacking in our society. And that whole thing where a return to myth, a return to story, a return to ritual, a return to some communal understanding of these things is important. Advancements we've made towards individuality, towards rationality, towards debunking oppressive mythology and debunking the demonization of various types of experience, have all been important and good, but the integration around it is important, obviously. Because the truth is there's no escaping it. We're living out cultural myths. We have our communal, experience. There is a zeitgeist, whether you want there to be one or not, and looking at what that is, and again bringing consciousness to it. This myth or this archetype or this energy is the right one, and all the other ones are wrong, is where we get into so much trouble.
I think that's really well put.
Narrative psychotherapy, for example, sometimes when someone hears me talk, it can sound like I'm poo-pooing narrative therapy, and it's like, I'm not. I think narrative therapy is an extremely important, powerful form of psychotherapy. But I think it can be practiced in a way that is opposite of what its actual intention is. Because I think the actual intention of narrative therapy is not simply to cognitively override every other level of your being and create what seems like should be the correct narrative, and then program yourself to try to think that way. I think the goal of narrative therapy in its essence is that it's actually about trying to discover what is one's narrative. And yes, to bring consciousness to it and to identify perceptions or misconceptions, or identify ways where the person is struggling to understand their own narrative. There's that element. And yes, we have an ability to consciously affect our narrative, but it's also important to not just say that we can just, I don't think we have the ability to just consciously override all the other levels and just write this new narrative. And to the extent that we can do that, it can be quite harmful.
Well, I think that's related to the imaginal, though, just as far as what you're talking about with myth and story, that we have an unconscious narrative going all the time based in this ego structure that we've been talking about. In that it's often, I imagine, because I don't know that as much about narrative psychotherapy, but that it's at least realizing that you're writing your own story to an extent, and that the things you choose to do are not the things you do or don't do, or may not be in line with what you actually think should be. If you start to see that narrative, you may want to edit parts of it, or you may want to make more interesting characters in it. I think that's right in line with what you've been talking about, because it's an imaginal effort in a way.
This stuff gets into, or I should say, if you dive deeper, the whole topic around like how much, it gets down to the free will conversation. Are we highly motivated by unconscious factors? Even within the world of psychotherapy, it's like, okay, there was the discovery of the unconscious, is the way it often gets put, right? The discovery of the unconscious. And then, of course, it's kind of funny that in the Western world, we discovered the unconscious, and it's like...
Then we said, forget that.
Right. But there were lots of religions that were very versed in the idea of the unconscious prior prior to the late 1800s, But if we say that in the late 1800s we discovered the unconscious, there's been these kind of phases to it where it was like, okay, there's an unconscious, and my understanding of it is initially, and this kind of Freud's view was, the unconscious is kind of this just disorganized storm of drives. But then you had more and more of these ideas around the unconscious being structured. And just simply put, Jung said the unconscious is structured into archetypes. Lacan said the unconscious is structured as a language. And then both those things had huge implications. But Freud, Jung, and Lacan are all in the analytic tradition. Psychotherapy, they're in the analytic school. So even Lacan said, I am first and foremost a Freudian. So for all the differences that Freud and Jung and Lacan and these guys had, they were all in the analytic school, and again, a lot of the things I'm talking about with regard to energies and unconsciousness and the imaginal realm and archetypal structures and all this, those all come out of the analytic tradition. This place that we find ourselves in modern day, where the structures that society used to provide with regard to how to work with and interpret imaginal experience, keep being done away with, and each individual is left to try to contend with their own imaginal experience, absent structures, rituals, myths to help them navigate all that. It mentally leaves the average individual in this very precarious, weakened position in relation to the powers of the imaginal.
And a weakened ability to filter out other people's reactions to it. It's like communion. If everybody has the ritual of communion, if someone shows up at communion and does something the wrong way, everyone notices. But if someone is spewing racism from this imaginal place in their psyche that's like fueled by fear of some ancient archetype that they don't understand and refuse to acknowledge in themselves, and no one has a filter for what is appropriate or what the communal truth is, it's infectious. It's a disease, like you're saying.
Totally.
These kids need church. I know that's not what you're saying, but it's kind of what you're saying. That there has to be a structure to respond to. There has to be a structure to deconstruct, and there's no structure to the imaginal in culture to react to or redefine for yourself. There's no starting place. So it's like we've talked about, it's this fertile ground for cults, for adhering to someone else's worldview totally and completely in a way that you don't even understand because you don't have anything there to compare it to. This is the doom and gloom episode of the Dimension Approach podcast. So next week we'll try to think of something happier to talk about.
Yeah, and it's funny because or funny is not the right word, but there is that element to this stuff that we're talking about. That when you get into awakening, if you're going to make that shift from the idea of ego-oriented awareness to consciousness, then doom and gloom is a part of it because death is a part of it. We need to go into that at some point here, that death plays a huge role in awakening. That from the ego point of view, it just seems like this movement towards more and more doom and gloom, more and more darkness, more and more hopeless experience, and there's a truth to that. That it understandably we run from, and largely it's only those that find themselves unsuccessfully running from it that are in the throes having to deal with it. But the big part of my practice is working with people in those kinds of places, and I don't try to take someone into those places. As I've said, before, I'm just working with where I see them at. But a lot of people are at that. I mean, we all kind of know depression, for example, suicidality, and not just suicides. The number of suicides is staggering. But if there was a way to get accurate numbers on how many people are struggling with suicidal ideation, really alarming. Obviously, to be in a state where you're having suicidal ideation, that's obviously a doom and gloom kind of situation.
Something I was thinking about in the depths and the throes of this darkness, that suicide is almost it can feel like an action that can be taken in the face of this darkness.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a dark thought. I'm not saying this is like something but it's that attempt. It's another attempt to control via this a structure that you may not even face that structure until you're in the throes of that. But it feels like something that can at least be done in the face of that darkness. And there's a point like I'm trying to think about or figure out with that. Maybe if we go into this more, thinking about how, or wondering how you see that and how you bring awareness, because awareness outside of it is honestly like the only thing that can relieve it. Some sense of self beyond that darkness is the only thing that heals that.
Yeah, that's definitely how I see it. And yeah, that'd be good to go into that. I mean, it's, what you said about it being an action that can be taken. I agree with that. There, Freud came to the idea of the death drive. There's the general idea of thanatos. We can extend the doom and gloom for many episodes.
There's plenty of it.
Yeah. But really important, profound stuff that I think it would be good to really dive into. That ultimately is hopeful.
Right. We just got to make sure all of that's in one episode.
Right.
Maybe that's a longer one, but there's no cliffhangers there.
Yeah. But what you just said, I mean, I think it really comes down to that. And, like I've said, the entanglement, you put it well earlier that, when that what you're not entangled in, then you can be empathic with. And, but that means you have to have, faced it. Right. We desperately need in relation to the suicidality, in relation to the struggle with the death drive, I think we need this cultural shift where instead of trying to simply get away from that, we've got to face it. We've got to look at it, and we need more places in our culture where the dark, hopeless, death, suicidality part of life, part of the psyche is looked at and is approached in a way, is approached with awareness, consciousness, in order to do the thing you said, to bring that awareness beyond it. Because what we do right now is we turn away from it. And I get why, but we turn away from it. It's I'm feeling suicidal. Well, don't do that. Don't look there. Don't feel that. How can we get you away from that? And again, it's like, well, for obvious reasons, that's the quick reaction. Let's do whatever the fuck we have to have you not feeling suicidal, to have you not thinking about death, to have you not experiencing this pull, this urge towards death. And it's futile to try to go that way, and be going towards it with conscious awareness is actually what's needed to bring someone through it.
If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.